Welcome everyone, and I hope that you find today useful. The intention obviously is really just to talk about the new version of LG10, which is the lighting guide concerned with daylighting. I'm saying new, but it was actually published at towards the end of 2014, and 2015 was a busy year, so we're a bit late presenting it, but better late than never. Jane mentioned that we had a group of people whose sustained effort really was the reason why we now have a revised guide. And as she mentioned, they came from a diverse range of specialities, and these are the people who were involved in the guide. And we also were very lucky to have advice and guidance from some esteemed colleagues such as Joe Lyons. Thank you very much. And it was really the result of all these efforts that we ended up with a revised guide. So in the presentation today, I'm really just, first of all, I've split it into two parts. In the first part, I want to talk to you about some of the advances that have happened in the field of daylighting since 1999. And these are the changes that we as a task group felt were the main drivers behind the revision of the guide. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to just take you through some of the highlights of the 2014 revision. So the first change that we identified concerns the non-visual effects of daylight. And the first one here, the circadian stimulus, it's arguably the most significant change that's occurred since 1999. In 2001, there was a paper published by Brainerd and colleagues that gave us scientific evidence for a non-visual photoreceptor in the retina. And really, it gave us the scientific support for what was perhaps already felt by people in the field, which is that daylight was essential in buildings, not just from an energy point of view, but also for the health and well-being of people, of its occupants. So that was one of the main changes. And then we also, we knew quite a lot about the importance of a visual connection with the outdoors in the 1999 guide, certainly. But since 1999, more work has been done, more research effort has been made in this field, and more efforts have been made to develop the theoretical framework around why view is important and what elements contained within that view how they have different impacts on the occupants of a building. And we also have learned in the intervening period more about the effect of controlled UV light or sunlight exposure to human beings. So, for example, we're constantly learning new things about that aspect, like the lowering of blood pressure through UV exposure to the skin, and so on. And obviously, that aspect was in the press quite a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. In terms of should we be wearing sunscreen, and should we be shielding ourselves from sunlight or not? And I think the consensus is that sunlight in buildings is a good thing, provided it's not causing a direct problem that's hindering people from their work or their task. And obviously in buildings where UV light needs to be excluded for functional reasons, for example if it's a gallery or so on. So the upshot of this part, these advances here, is that we could see that more emphasis needed to be put on the qualitative aspects of daylighting. So the next sort of change or shift that occurred in the period since 1999 is, I'm using the term mainstream, but really what I'm saying here is that in 1999 and up until the late 90s, low energy building was left to the pioneers and mavericks, and now it's not like that at all. Now it's widespread, and part of that is because the regulatory framework has given us, made it mandatory for many of us to design to those standards. So one effect of this is that it's given the daylight specialist more prominence, or certainly the building physicist, because their role has become more and more important in terms of modelling the energy use of the building accurately to check that we're complying with these, with the regulations, with the building regulations, for example, and also with energy targets such as BREEAM or LEED or whatever the client has decided to impose on the building. But the downside of this is that it gives us a greater risk that there's going to be a bit of compliance chasing going on instead of designing the building from the point of view of good daylighting. So we could see that there was a real need to emphasize how to approach daylighting in a holistic way and not to just try to chase compliance. The third area that changed significantly is our capability when it comes to modelling buildings, and clearly from a daylighting point of view our capabilities have increased a lot, and the main driver has been the exponential increase in computing power that's available to us now. So with the increase in computing power we were able to develop new tools. I've mentioned climate-based daylight modelling here. Really what I'm saying is we have some new tools, and this has enabled us to develop new metrics such as useful daylight illuminance from the climate-based framework. And also it's allowed us to think of the distribution of daylight in the space, not just in terms of horizontal planes anymore. So for example, we can create luminance maps such as the one shown here in the image. And it allows us to think about the distribution of daylight in a quantitative way on all the surfaces in the room, albeit it might be linked to a specific viewpoint in the space. However, we also recognised that even though there was a huge increase in what we could do with computers, that it was also very important that we retained our connection with tactile approaches such as physical modelling, but I'll talk a little bit about that later when I explain what's in the 2014 guide. So the next one here, this is the last sort of area of shift that we considered to be important, was the developments in technology. Clearly since 1999 glazing technology has moved on. In 1999 we still saw the use of things like static tinted, body tinted glass, and that has really fallen out of use. Part of the main reason behind this is that things have really moved on in terms of coatings, glazing coatings, and we now have glass that can perform really well from the point of view of solar control without the need to tint the glass so that it's visibly tinted. And we also have a whole range of really exciting new materials, and I know I'm biased, but electrochromic glazing being one of them. And the electrochromic is one of the what I call smart glazing materials, which are glazing materials that don't stay, they're not static, they're dynamic, and they can change their optical properties in response to an external stimulus. And this coupled with advances in sensor technology and better control interfaces has really helped us to start thinking of facades as dynamic elements. So they're not just static envelopes anymore. They're possibly an element of the building that controls the flow of heat and light in a much more dynamic way. I'll talk a little bit more about the kinds of materials that are included in the 2014 guide when I move on to that section later on. Just for your information as well, the image at the top here is of an electrochromic glazing installation. So the top image shows the glass when it's not tinted, and then the bottom one shows it when it's tinted. And most of you probably recognise the ETFE there at the Eden project. So now I'm going to take you through some highlights that I've chosen to pick out to talk you through today in the 2014 guide. So one of the main differences between the new guide and the 99 version is the structure. It's radically different, and we chose to restructure it quite significantly to make it clearer and easier to kind of use, particularly for various members of the design team. So not just lighting people or daylighting people, but for a range of people to be able to dip in and out of the guide. We've also introduced a new section that's dedicated to visualization. So I mentioned earlier about the advances that have been made in terms of the techniques that we use to model and visualize buildings. So we felt that warranted its own section. And you can see there, I've shown you the main parts of the document. The document is made up of 4 parts. The structure that we've got in the 2014 guide is very much based on design stages. So, for example, we've got the initial design considerations and the detailed design considerations. And the other point that I wanted to highlight really was the title change. The 1999 guide, I did have an image of it, but it's too far back. The 1999 guide was called Daylighting and Window Design, and we chose to change the title. And it was a subject of quite a lot of discussion in the task group, because windows, the word windows means different things to different people. But I felt that it was a restrictive term. And I think, you know, as a task group, we agreed that our remit was much beyond window design. So we decided to lose the window reference. And we stuck with daylighting. And we've also used the term designers because, again, we just wanted the document to be accessible for a range of members of the design team, not just daylighting specialists. So the first, earlier on, I mentioned one of the sort of shifts in thinking in the daylighting field, and that related to the qualitative aspects of daylighting. So in other words, the importance of daylighting, the importance of daylight in buildings for health and well-being. So in the 2014 document, we've really tried to address that by balancing out the document more, so that it's got more emphasis on the qualitative side, and what one of our task group members used to refer to as the poetic aspects of daylighting. And part of this is reflected in some of the images that we've used in the document. And also, I think, by the fact that we were very lucky to have a foreword by Peter Clegg from Field & Clegg Bradley Associates, and he was very articulate at encapsulating what it is about daylight that's not, it cannot be explained by numbers. You have to address daylighting by looking at the qualitative and quantitative aspects. So as I said, we've put more emphasis on that side of things. It's important to note that the developments that we saw in terms of the discovery of the non-visual photoreceptor and our increased knowledge about the circadian system and how daylight is the main stimulus for entrainment of the body clock and so on, it's important to note that those developments haven't really yet culminated in any quantitative guidance. The jury is still out in terms of how to specify a dose of daylight for occupants within buildings. So we haven't been able to translate that into numbers, but as I said, what we have done is try to put more emphasis on those elements, because it's important to understand that occupants need access to daylight, even if it's physical access. So even if the building design facilitates their ability to get out of the building, if you like, to small breakout spaces where daylight is more dominant. And one area where we have been able to really put in a lot more detail is on the view out. So in the 99 guide, we already knew that a view out was important, as I mentioned earlier, but we've been able to introduce some more slightly structured, you could say, guidance on, for example, I don't expect you to be able to read this table, it's really just to illustrate what's in the document, but in this table here, we're explaining how the distance from the window and the view angle of the occupant, how important those aspects are at determining the composition of the view that the person will have from different positions within the space. We also have retained some of the obviously we've retained a lot of elements from the 99 guide, but particularly with regard to view, one of my favourite figures from the 99 guide was where we had the window framing the view, and it showed how you could have, for example, the foreground and middle ground, or you could have the middle ground and the sky, but ideally you have the foreground, middle ground and sky all present in the view window. So I think that's a very useful aspect. The next area here that we can talk about is the new section on modelling and visualisation. So I think I need to emphasise that it's not all about computers. We have obviously brought the guidance up to date by including detailed information on different computer techniques, computer-based techniques. But we've also been very careful to retain the more classical approaches, and as I mentioned earlier, the more tactile, physical approaches. So I've picked out some images here just to show some examples. We've got the artificial sky there and a shoebox model here in the middle with a mirror, and a heliodon there for shadow studies. With the increased capability of computer-based modelling came an ability to model interiors and indeed exteriors in a very photorealistic way, and this could be seen as a double-edged, as a blessing and a curse, really, because I think one of the dangers is that when you present something that looks photorealistic to clients or to any audience, they can be very easily misled into thinking that that's what the finished lighting effect is going to look like. And clearly it depends on what the inputs were to the model, whether or not that is realistic. And one of the advantages of the more classical techniques, I suppose, is that everyone around the table is looking at a scale model, and nobody is in any doubt about what they're looking at. They don't think that they're, you know, it's not virtual reality, it's a model. And also, I mean, there's so many wonderful advantages. You can get your hands into it and, you know, manipulate things and so on and so forth. So in the new guide, we've really tried to keep a blend of old and new from the point of view of modelling. And the other thing that we've tried to do is emphasise the difference between models that are used for quantitative analysis and models that are used for more qualitative analysis, so indeed for visualization purposes, whether it's for a client or for marketing purposes or however. And we had some great input from some colleagues at Arup on the modelling side, and these images here show some of the projects that they were working on, these ones on the left. And then the next area where we've really updated the guidance is on the technology, on glazing technology. So the 2014 guide has a really comprehensive section on glazing technology. What we've tried to do is explain to a would-be specifier what the different what different aspects of the specification of a piece of glazing, how important they are in relative terms, So for example, this graph, again, I don't expect you to be able to read the writing on the graph, but it shows the G factor, the factor which is concerned with solar control, versus the visible transmittance of a range of commercially available glazing materials. And again, the person who's reading this, they're not using this to specify the glazing, but it's really to inform them and equip them to then talk to a manufacturer so that they understand why there's a trade-off between, for example, the G factor and the visible transmittance. The other thing we've done is brought in more information about smart glazing materials, and in particular electrochromic glazing. And we've also mentioned a range of what I'm calling non-glass materials, such as ETFE. We've got a really nice comprehensive passage about ETFE and about when to specify it and all those things. And we've also got some examples of some more esoteric materials like translucent panels, such as the ones used here at the Laban Centre. We've also mentioned films that can be applied to glass in a retrofit scenario. And this image here is of a product called Solar Veil, which is a microprism. So it's a film, but it's a microprismatic material, and it's there to control glare from the sun, and it can be applied retrospectively, as it has been done in this case. And I mentioned electrochromic glazing. I keep mentioning it because I am currently in the writing up stage of some research that we've been doing at DeMontfort University. So I couldn't resist the opportunity to just kind of give a quick mention to the study. In the study, we retrofitted the windows in some offices on campus, and they're quite large southeast-facing windows, so they were a really good test bed. And we've replaced those windows with electrochromic windows, and we monitored the room and the occupants for nearly 2 years. So I just wanted to mention it because it is a very interesting material, and it's also moved on even since we had the windows installed. So in this image here, you can see a line in the middle of the glass, and that's essentially a bus bar that helps the electrical current to spread through the coating. But in the latest version, you can't see that. So, and the capability has even increased so that it can go down to a lower transmittance, and, it has a very good transmittance in the non-tinted state. For those of you that don't know, it's basically, it's chromogenic material, so it changes its tint in response to a change in applied voltage, which is very small. So as I said, I'm excited, but then I have to be. So we thought that in the 2014 guide it was really important to mention these developments, and in the 2014 guide we've got some images of some installations of electrochromic glazing in other buildings throughout Europe. This last slide here, well, it's not the last slide, but this slide here is to take you through the last highlight, really, and it's to make the point that we've really updated the images in the guide to reflect not just contemporary buildings, but we've also introduced some really inspiring examples that weren't in the 99 guide. So, for example, we've got Ronchamp here by Le Corbusier, and Taddeo Ando, one of his churches. But another thing that's really interesting is we managed to get a photograph of the roofscape at the Soane Museum. So the Soane Museum was in the 99 guide because it's a really great classical example. But as well as putting a photo of the breakfast room in there, we've also been able to do what is essentially a small study of the roofscape, because it really shows how Soane used a smorgasbord of different opening types to get light to penetrate deep into the building. So that is one of the more original and really interesting bits of some of the new illustrations that have gone into the guide. And speaking of illustrations, I wanted to give like a special sort of bit of a mention about the cover image on the 2014 guide, because it is unusual. It is quite different from what you might expect to find on a guide. Usually you might see a contemporary office building or something like that. And in this image here, what you can see is how the internal burial chamber at the Newgrange Monument looks when it's illuminated by the sun on the winter solstice. And so it's really magical, because what happens is on the winter solstice and for a few days either side, the sun is in just the right position to shine through this lintel window above the door, and it gets right down this passageway into the burial chamber, which you can't see. And so the building, the image was chosen because it really encapsulates so many of the key concepts that we're trying to get across in the guide. For example, it's a really wonderful example of a building that was designed in a site-sensitive way. So it's truly synchronized with the sun's movements in that sense. And another key thing that it really wraps up is the importance of sunlight in interiors, and how it can, because I've been in there when they simulate this for visitors. They don't, not everyone can manage to get there on the winter solstice. I think there's actually a lottery to get there on the winter solstice, but they simulate the sun coming into the chamber for visitors. And the technology that they use is sadly not really very advanced. But I must say that when you're standing in the chamber, you actually feel a physical sensation of warmth, even whether it's coming from a halogen lamp or not. We'll put that to one side. But I do think that it's a great example of how sunlight entering an interior can really affect you in a physical and psychological way. And it also encapsulates the one of the other key messages of the guide, which is the connection between the inside and the outside. So a reminder from the inside of the building about the existence of, you know, the seasons, and a connection with nature in that sense. So these are the reasons why we chose this image. And it obviously does have personal significance for me, because I visited the site when I was at school in the 90s, and I've been back several times as a grown-up, and I do think that it probably had quite a lot to do with sparking my interest in daylight in buildings. So this is my concluding slide, but I do feel that we should enter into a discussion. I might have rushed over certain points, so if anybody wants to you know, get me to rewind a little bit and talk about any particular aspects, I'm very happy to do that. So thanks very much, and the floor is open. Okay. Hi.
Sorry, in that you were the official scientist and I was the official artist/hippie in the group. I used to run a design practice in London and moved down to Cornwall, and I just wanted to bring together something which is very special about this group, which is that we're not all London-based. You're in DeMontfort, I was out in Cornwall when I was working on the project. We had people coming down from Glasgow, and I think that was the whole special thing about the group, that we all had our own culture to bring with us. I'm going to get shot because I need to make reference to the fact that we have the view out of the Portmere Studios on display, and if you could just go back there. The thing that was very lucky was
So that's this one
That's
here.
the one,
Yeah.
but we were very lucky that a number of contemporary architects wanted to be included and brought into the idea of the guide actually looking at refurbished heritage spaces and the best in contemporary architecture. So I was allowed to sneak in whilst this particular studio, which looks out over St Ives, Porthmeor Beach, was being refurbished. And so I think we had about 6 different editings of how you spell Porthmeor and whatever. And it finally made it into the guide. But I think what is terribly important, and this is why the guide is selling so well, is that although it's got all the new metrics, funnily enough, a lot of people like to keep it on a bookshelf because it's got all of the lovely pictures. So we've produced a coffee table standard guide as well as a textbook. I hope you're happy with me for interrupting.
No, that's thank you.
Quickly, I had a quick look through it. It's really good. I like it a lot. It brings together a lot of thought. I only had one little criticism, if I may. And I don't know whether that was a choice or whether that was you ducked out a little bit, if you want to say so, on Solar Dazzle. So rather than tackling it full on and going, come on, let's talk about modelling, let's talk about luminescences, let's talk about finishes. You point to a document, 1987 by Paul Littlefare, and was that a conscious choice, or was that because you can't cover everything, which I get, but obviously that is a big issue out there at the moment, and some more definitive guidance would have been helpful. And I just felt it perhaps missed a trick. Just my thoughts.
No, I agree with you, and I think I was conscious of that at the time as well. And what we did do is we brought in, I don't know whether you noticed, but we've got the walkie-scorchy in there.
Well, that's why it's so relevant.
Yeah, and it was. And we sort of moved on. No, I do agree, and I think, I suppose part of it was because we felt a bit maybe overwhelmed about how you might approach that problem in a quantitative way. And perhaps we lacked someone on the task group who had experience of modelling it. So, for example, we had, I think, between us, we knew that there were certain things you could do to avoid those situations. So, for example, don't design a concave facade. But, we kind of left it at that. We didn't then take it one step further and say, how might you analyse this in a more analytical way and in a more quantitative way. So, I really do take that on board. But I think, thank you. Anyone else? Sorry, yes.
Just a question, because I haven't looked at it yet, and I'm absolutely turned on by your exposition. Sounds absolutely fascinating. But what I always found a bit disappointing in the 1999, which was itself a reworking of an earlier one, was that sort of stepping away from making any comments about target daylight factors for different building types and uniformity particularly. Now, I have to say that it is a double-edged sword, because some of the computer modelling techniques produce totally spurious results when the original kind of broad brush factors were really based on physical modelling, where you had a very small number of sample points, or actually manual calculations, so you weren't picking up spuriously small areas of a surface which had there are always shadows in the room, but we don't mind if they're small areas. But and subsequently, when I've been working in the last 6 or 8 years with school design design, environmental design, I found it very useful to be able to say to the architects, right, this sort of classroom have a certain percentage of glazing, this sort of, the labs can have that sort of glazing, and look at putting them on different facades for both thermal and also having a concept of uniformity. Have you tackled the issue of uniformity, or have you made recommendations?
We have made recommendations, but I don't think we've significantly changed them from the 1999 guide in terms of making it specific to different spaces. But part of the reason for that is because of new metrics such as UDI, we haven't really we haven't committed to one or the other, because we're not there yet. We certainly weren't there when we were publishing the guide, so we had to provide a range of guidance, a range of aspects in terms of guidance of metrics for people to refer to. And the other issue is that what one doesn't want to end up happening is that the guide goes out of date because it doesn't line up with other documents, and that can happen very quickly. So we've referred the reader to other documents where they might find specific guidance on specific types of spaces. But there is a substantial amount of information there in terms of percentage glazing and so on. So you might find that it's hard to know whether it has what you're speaking about, but I hope that helps to answer it, at least in part.
Certainly what I found is at work that there was a kind of battle between the environmental modellers doing the energy calcs and the architects and environmental consultants doing the sort of concept design. And the modellers were going, oh no, cut down, we're overheating. And I have to say, there are problems with those simulations as well, because I think that they are, even though, you've got vast computers, they still are doing very simple-minded and not terribly realistic calculations. Is my view.
Yes,
and so you sit there going, oh well, at least get a 2% daylight factor, even if you can't get a 4% one, and you felt like you were in between a sort of tug of war between different people in the design team.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I think that's a fascinating discussion, and I think the qualitative components may be, I think there's always a risk that when you put a numeric number to something that you hit the number, but if the manufacturer is giving you sort of a really poor quality of light through that transmission, I think this is leading sort of to a broader discussion, which I guess we've all been hungry to hear, which is probably the broader qualitative aspect, which I think comes through very clearly. I think the case studies are absolutely lovely, and it's great to see. There is a dilemma, because I work for a mainstream engineering company, and there is the performance numbers, which everyone says, but what is this or that, and everyone likes to put a number to it. But I think the qualitative matrix is where you put in a number of factors, is a really good way to go. And I think we've seen that on artificial lighting too, where again we used to get this question of uniformity, and some architects would say, 0.8 uniformity, absolutely wonderful, let's get that. But actually the periphery edges around the room, could be different. So I think it's a conversation which is ongoing.
I think the qualitative aspect, because obviously one of the conversations we also all have is, so you don't hit 2%, and therefore let's just get rid of the window. No, that's just for whatever, under 2%, or you need artificial lighting on all the time. Do you? I think we'd all agree, certainly I hope you all agree, that any daylight is better than no daylight at all.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and we've got the Kimball Museum in there as well for that reason, because trying to make that point that any daylight, or even the impression of daylight in the space, is more important than no daylight. And we do mention uniformity, but on uniformity as well, another thing occurred to me, which is that we haven't really. It depends on the building, obviously, and it depends on the application, but we certainly don't want to suggest that that the target should be to create a uniformly lit space, So, it does depend on the task, and for task areas that's important, but perhaps it's more important to create a rhythm, like you see with long thin windows, or so on and so forth. So we've carried that over, that kind of thinking over from the guide, but we haven't gone so far as to say daylight factor this, uniformity that. We've certainly talked about the need to avoid harsh contrasts where you on a task area. So, yeah.
Ruth, I realised that the lady who's asked the question came in as I was explaining about how you can get the free download of the guide and you can actually get it. If you're a member of CIBSE, then you can go on and it's available as a PDF. I don't know if you realise that all of the technical publications, lighting design guides are available if you join as a member. But I just had 2 minutes to introduce the Technical and Publications Committee and to introduce Ruth. And I think that you have just arrived. So if you are at all concerned and would like to look at every publication, including this one for free, it's available as a PDF.
Graham was first.
Sorry.
Ruth, I'm going to really, try to stir it up a bit here.
Yeah.
Do you ever think we'll be able to describe daylighting in a room in terms of a few simple metrics? Because what it strikes me is that in fact we don't just see the room, we sense it with all our senses. And these are quite complicated and highly subjective. So our only true subjectivity or objectivity is intersubjective objectivity, where other people tend to agree in a certain sense, but not everybody. In which case, will we one day say, perhaps we've got to go back to Joe's idea of domains, but this time domes of acceptability, or domes that would be okay to design within.
Yes, I agree. I'd love to have an answer for that. Are we going to? I mean, my gut feeling is no, because I think what we need to do is we can have a quantitative framework where we say, for example, using maybe a luminance map, we can look at the interior and say, this is broad, this is what we need to be aiming for. But we need to then couple that with a lot of other criteria that are not going to be quantitative and shouldn't be quantitative. Yes, I agree that there's a case for trying to design within an envelope or a range of criteria that suit maybe a majority of people. But the key thing is that we can't design without thinking about the occupant at the centre of it. And if a building works on paper, that's great. But once you put people in, this is one of the main things that's come out of my research for me in particular, is that once you put people into it, it might not work anymore. And then you have to say it doesn't work, because if people aren't interacting with the element in the way that they were supposed to, or so on, then the energy consumption that you intended is not going to work, and so on.
So you have to work with people's expectations. I walked into the cathedral here, and it's just what you expect of an old medieval cathedral,
Yeah.
And anybody else going in would feel the same, perhaps.
Yes.
But you're designing it for was it goodies for people or things?
I mean, just to give an example of that, I know a guy who does school design quite well, and he said the one thing I don't want is the kids looking out the window.
Ah, yeah, that's going back to the Victorian high windowsill.
So you're going on to me about good daylight,
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
it might be, and I don't want them looking out.
They don't want them looking out. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think what slightly worries me with UDI and CDDM, because
Yeah.
I can see where the number is becoming more onerous.
Yeah.
Not onerous, no wrong word. Lenny is good, lighting control
Yeah.
is good, I get all of that. But as soon as it becomes, as you say, this metric, and take people out of it, then
Yes.
you get a bit stuffed.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yes.
I'm going
Yes.
to come from completely the opposite angle. It seems to me somewhere in that discussion there's how do we develop a metric by going back and doing post-occupancy evaluation of spaces in order to develop a better understanding.
Yeah.
I think I would argue that every time we develop a metric, it's an approach to try and improve our understanding of people, because ultimately we're designing for the people in the space, not for the space. But my question developing from that is, when do you next revise this guide? And I'm interested because I was disappointed to hear that you stopped short of developing metrics for those three, I think, more important than the things that we're measuring at the moment, items that we've got up there at the moment.
Yes.
Health, well-being, and aesthetics. And I want to
Yes.
make it, I'm from New Zealand, so this is kind of me trying to understand local London after 4 months.
Customs.
And I was aware of the walkie-stalkie. It certainly hit the newspaper all around the world, and everyone who was into architecture was aware that the architect had designed a concave building in Las Vegas that had the same
Yes.
problem.
Yes.
And so we all thought this architect was terrible. I have learned since I arrived here, and it may be wrong, but it was the value engineering exercise that took the sun shading off that curved surface that resulted in what we saw in terms of the focusing of light.
Yes.
Without those health, well-being and aesthetic metrics in that value engineering exercise having equivalent, if you do that, this will happen, they have nowhere near the same power
Yes.
in the value engineering exercise as the dollar. And to me, I want something that enables me to hit back against that and say, yes, but,
Yeah.
not in some vague, it will look better, people will be somehow healthier,
Yeah.
but be able to argue more strongly how much of an impact will this be.
That's a really good point, because it definitely does help your argument if you can say this doesn't hit that target, and if that target is a number or at least in some way related to a number, it certainly makes it more difficult to put the argument across. But I think we are struggling, in the field to really reach a consensus on those aspects, and people are really desperate for it, particularly I think for what they're referring to as the dosage, the daylight dosage, and maybe approaching it from almost a medical angle and saying, in order to affect your circadian system, you need X, and you need it for this length of time, and so on. And we would love it, and I like to think that we're all coming to that point soon, but we're not there, and that's how we definitely weren't able to include that kind of information in this guide. But the question of when we're going to revise it again, I don't know. I mean, if it's judging by past performance, it will probably be to 2019 or 2020, but I can't really say. I do think it would be better if we revised it when we knew that we could make a significant change in terms of translating this guidance into more target-based guidance.
Can I ask a question about this
Yes.
daylight dosage?
Yeah.
Surely that's strongly related. It's a moving target because it's strongly related to the age of the viewer.
Yes, it would be, I suppose. And of course, classically, all this stuff tends to come from studies that are based on 50, 20-year-olds. So it's a really good point. We should take into account the fact that when we're 40 or whatever, that our retina is not going to receive the same amount of daylight. So. Yes, and that information is available somewhere, isn't it? It might be in one of the other lighting guides, but I'm not quite sure. We don't really go into it in LG10, but I think, yeah, that's a very good point. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, does the guide talk about influence of daylight on lighting color? For example, we have got, we're going around putting in LED lamps that are cool white, or more bluish white kind of color.
Yes.
And when the daylight's actually coming in, it's coming in at a different color.
Yeah, yeah.
So does the guide talk about what's going to be influence on people, and how do we sort of model it?
Yes, we do touch on in the section. I think the section where it's mentioned is the integration of daylight with electric lighting or artificial lighting. So we talk about techniques for integrating, or the considerations that one needs to make when integrating daylight with artificial sources. And I think colour gets a mention, but we don't, I mean, in terms of modelling, I think it's possible to model these things, but it's not currently, as far as I know, possible to model colour temperature accurately. So to show the effect of different colour temperature sources. And again, even if it were possible, I'm not sure how useful it would be, because it wouldn't result in any numbers necessarily. It would show you, possibly, it would help you to visualise what the end result was going to look like. But it wouldn't, for example, tell us what the psychological or physiological effect would be. So it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, really, where if we have a certain quantity of daylight in the space, you know, we might know that a certain quantity is required in order to get our body clocks going and you know, to tell our body that it's a certain time of day or whatever. And that if we blend that with other sources, I think it's going to be very subjective, and it will depend on the application. There's no right or wrong. You can't really say to people, the artificial source has to be this colour temperature because it has to be significantly different from the daylight, or it depends on the effect that the designer is trying to achieve, I think, in the end. We haven't really allowed the technology of lighting, of electric lighting, to come into it too much, again because it would date the document so much, and we don't want to overlap too much with the other lighting guides, which go into a lot more detail about those kinds of issues.
Thank you. Sorry, one more.
No,
question.
it's okay.
That's right. On one of your slides, you talk about climate-based
Yes.
daylight modelling. So what modelling techniques do you use? Is there any recommended sort of modelling tools?
Yes. What we've done is we haven't mentioned any actual, which slide was it? We haven't mentioned specific products, but we've talked about the kind of framework behind the different techniques. So we've talked about ray tracing and radiosity and the differences between them and how they can affect the results. We have had to avoid really saying do it this way or do it that way. Instead, it's like, here's a range of tools, and you know, you can use this in combination with that, or so on. Again, it's because we haven't yet reached a consensus on that thing either, on the metrics, you know, because it's still being debated, and as you'll see you probably saw from the programme, there's still a lot of debate over UDI and where we should use it, and whether it should be in more regulations, or you know, whether it should be brought more into other aspects of the regulatory framework and so on. So it's a bit frustrating for us that we haven't been able to put a sort of stake in the ground, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Ruth, have you seen, what do you think of people trying to artificially recreate daylight effects? And have you seen the Colux products?
Yes.
Have you been under it? And what do you think about those attempts?
Yeah, I haven't actually been under the Colux. I wanted to go and see it. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I've been under it a few times. It is actually, it's easily sufficiently convincing enough to make you feel,
yes,
to convince you it's daylight.
I was really impressed by the images I saw. I
thought the images were renders when I first saw
it.
But no, and it's still Idea Works in West London.
Oh, is it? Yeah.
I'd recommend you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know if you've been under any others, because quite often architects and people try to recreate daylight by having diffused panels or things like that. But it's the first time I've seen anything where you recreate the duality of spatial and spectral effects convincingly.
Yeah. I think one of the differences with the Colux as well is that it's got the sunlight, and I haven't seen that with anything else. and I was at a presentation of a research project that involved it was artificial windows. So again, it was like another product that was aimed at trying to introduce windows to a space that was landlocked, or for whatever reason they couldn't put real windows in there. I think I'm going to be very careful here, because this is my personal opinion and everyone will feel differently about it, but I personally am a bit horrified because I think it's because I know that real daylight, that there isn't really a substitute for it, and perhaps it's a case of, if there's a space where it's going to be really difficult to actually have windows or roof lights, that you can trick people into feeling more connected with outside. But I don't like the idea that people are fooled into thinking, it's a similar argument with biodynamic lighting as well, because it's like that thing of, is it ethical to manipulate people's physiology in that way to try and make students more alert in the morning, or it's a complex argument really, but yeah, that's how I feel about it myself, but there isn't a right or wrong.
It comes back to what you said earlier, the impression. You mentioned the impression that you are connected with outside. Do you consider that psychological connection with knowing what the conditions are outside are more important than any quantitative value?
Yes. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. But I think it's interesting. I was at a conference one time where the lecture theatre had no windows, and what they did was the conference was about light and humans. So it was kind of interesting. There were no windows, and what they did was they had a couple of big screens, not the one that was being used for the presentations, they had a couple of others, and they projected like not a CCTV, but a camera that was located, a webcam of the outside. They projected it onto the two screens, and it was an effort to maintain a connection with outside, but it didn't really work because everyone could see it was a projection, and it's arguable that perhaps it was better than nothing, but I think that the vehicle that delivers the information is very important as well. So when it's an opening where we can see directly to outside, or even if we can't see to outside but we can see that the light quality is changing, I think the vehicle is important, but certainly I do feel that that's more important than the quantity that's measured in the space.
Yeah, I can agree on the projector thing, because you can see it's going on a flat wall that is not windows, so straight away and also the light coming back off of that is in no way representative. Everywhere spatially the light will be entering through the window, so you don't have this scattered,
there's no depth
from the atmosphere, you don't have the shadow of light directly from the light source. But that's one of the really impressive things about the colour control, because it does actually, ethical things aside, it has actually created that impression of infinity.
Yes,
of it being an infinite atmosphere of your head, and creating the shaft of light. And the only giveaway is when you step into the shaft and you don't get the infrared.
Oh, I see.
That's the first time you go in.
Because you expect to feel, So
it's not recreating the full spectrum. Evidence of the sun, I mean, that'd be really hard to do, but it's 90% there, and it's just quite interesting.
It is very interesting, I would really love to get under it with a spectrometer as well, but I don't know if they'd like that. But I was really interested to know what the spectrum would be. But I'm really impressed by that. And I'm not saying it's I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think we have to be very careful, don't we, about how we use things like that.
Okay, perhaps we should close the meeting. Oh, Joe, right, one last question.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
When you're dealing with electric lighting, you talk about lux, and it's interesting that even experts can't say, without cheating and looking up at the lamps, can't say whether it's 200 lux or 500 lux.
Yes.
Whereas with daylight, to a large extent, we judge daylight, the daylight indoors, in relation to the daylight out of doors.
Yes.
And for that reason, so long as there isn't actually sunlight coming into the room, the daylight factor is quite a good indication of how much daylight you're getting indoors.
Yes.
So like you can say, I mean, if you're very used to daylight factors, you can say this is a 3% daylight factor, 2%, whatever.
Yes.
Just when you go walk into the room. What's wrong with daylight factors is that they're a bit abstract, that it actually doesn't mean anything to a non-specialist. However, it's not that difficult to convert from average daylight factors and a uniformity measure into terms of the probability of manual switching.
Yes.
Now, that's something that everybody can understand. If you say during the daylight hours there's a 30% chance, or a 60% chance, or whatever, of the lighting being switched on. And this is crude, but it's falsifiable. In other words, if it gives the wrong results, you can alter it, alter the criterion, and it seems to me that's the way to go, rather than, for example, the CBDM, which is based on lux, which in fact is not what people actually experience.
It's not what people feel. Yes, yeah. Yeah, I do agree. I think that, I mean, that's why we've retained all that information in the guide in terms of daylight factors and switch on probabilities and things like that, because ultimately, it also for the designers, it's very important to have an approach that they can use without having a lot of specialist software and a lot of resource in that regard. People feel, I think, that daylight factor is, well, I wondered, I don't know what you think of this, but I wondered if it was a good index of porosity of the building, and that's how I like to think of it. But like you say, it's abstract for others. Within our sphere, that's really good, but when you try to translate that to people outside of the specialism, then you need to be able to anchor them back to something that they can relate to. So yeah, thank you.
Is it worth adding that people have talked about colour of daylight and its relation to artificial. The video that was plugged at the beginning, that does actually deal with that to some extent.
Yes. And I've been plugging it continually every circulation.
Yeah.
Could I ask Michael to say a few words of thanks?
I think the words of thanks were said at the beginning, and I just want to endorse, on the basis of the presentation we just heard, I think I understand the clarity and leadership that you brought to this really disparate committee, because we've had a very elegant, to me, presentation of a complex technical subject in a short period of time that has enabled us all to make these kinds of questions relate what you've talked about to our own concerns. I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking you for an excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.